Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's special webinar, Ethics of Technologically Assisted Rehabilitation. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We would like to thank our academic team and our 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent project. Harnessing Talent, Alliance for Recruiting and Retaining Canadians with Disabilities and Mental Health Challenges, is a 3-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC, as well as donations and memberships to WWI. We thank our advisory committee and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. So while we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing, any comments you may have, and any questions related to the webinar. We will collect questions submitted throughout the webinar and follow it with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. A quick reminder, if you are a WWI member or a VRA Canada member, you will receive free certificates of attendance for this session. We are very excited to welcome Dr. Emma Smith all the way from the UK to talk to us about the ethics of technologically assisted rehabilitation. Emma Smith is an occupational therapist, researcher, and educator in the field of assistive and rehabilitation technology. Her work ranges from technology development to systems and policies to promote access to technology for people with disabilities, chronic illnesses, and functional impairments associated with aging. Emma has a particular interest in the ethical application of technology to promote wellness and independence in these populations. Emma, welcome. Thank you immensely for making the time to shed some light on the assistive and rehabilitation technology field, especially in the context of the pandemic. I will hand it over to you for the next hour, and I will come back with questions from our audience.
Thanks so much, Yusra. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today and talk to you about something which is very near and dear to my heart, which is the ethics of technology-assisted rehabilitation. So let's get started. Just to let you know at the beginning, I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. Just to give you a bit of an introduction as to who I am and my background and where I am. My background is actually in international development originally, and I then went on to become an occupational therapist. Following a number of years working clinically, I went on to do a PhD in rehabilitation sciences. So at that point, I really started working in the area of technology development, but also in ensuring that marginalized groups had access to the technologies that they needed. Throughout my career, I've worked from pediatrics to geriatrics. I've worked in mental health and physical health, worked really across the board, but I developed a passion for assistive technologies as I went along. And part of that was while I was working in schools and in workplaces, just seeing that the way that assistive technologies could really enhance somebody's capacity to participate in those aspects of life. I really found my home working with vulnerable populations and people with fairly severe physical disabilities, and then moved into the area of rights-based approaches to access to technology, as well as policy and practice. So Yusra mentioned that I actually live in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, so not quite in the UK, but very close. So you'll see up in the corner there the campus that I currently work on, which is called Maynooth University. So what we're going to talk about today, just around ethics, is a vast range of things. So we're going to start with the principles of medical ethics, so talking about there are some established principles of medical ethics and what those are, and so I'll walk you through those in terms of definitions and help you to understand what those mean. We're then going to shift a bit into the disability side and talk about disability and ethics specifically, so some of the really key considerations for each of those principles that we need to have. Then we move on to talking a bit more about the technology that we use in rehabilitation or in rehabilitative work. So some of those assistive technologies that we might be seeing in workplaces or in other areas. And then really dive into some of those very specific ethical considerations for rehabilitation or for assistive technology. I'm adding a section on privacy because it's not one of the principles of medical ethics, but I think it's really important to talk about from an ethical standpoint. And then we'll have an opportunity to wrap up and have some questions. So as I mentioned, there are 4 established principles of medical ethics. So the 4 established principles that we discuss regularly are the principles of autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually, and we're going to talk about each of them essentially twice in the course of the presentation. The first we're going to talk about is autonomy. So autonomy is what it sounds like. We use this as one of our sort of typical words in everyday language, but autonomy is how we acknowledge the value and decision-making rights of individuals that enable people to act independently. So when we're looking at supporting autonomy, we're wanting to make sure that people have all the information they need to make their individual decisions. That information needs to be disclosed to them, and it needs to be done so actively. We also want to make sure that in whatever the work we're doing, that individuals we take all the actions to promote that autonomous decision making. So any action we can to make sure that somebody's able to make all of their own decisions independently is best case scenario. But it also speaks to the removal of constraints. So we're saying that it's important in the space where there may be constraints against somebody's autonomy that we actively work to resolve those and to remove those constraints. When we're talking about justice, we're talking about the fair distribution of services or technology resulting in equitable treatment for all. And I think it's really important that we have a great understanding of what equitable means and just the concept of justice in general. So sometimes we get them confused with equal treatment, but when we're talking about equity and justice, we're more concerned with making sure that everybody has the means necessary for them to be successful. So we're not specifically talking about everybody having the same means or the same opportunities. We're talking about making sure that those opportunities fit the individual's needs to make sure that they are successful. So you may have seen this cartoon or some version of it, which looks at the differences between equality, equity, and justice. So what you'll see on the left-hand side, the image of equality, where we're making an assumption that everybody will benefit from having the same support. So you see in this case, a box is given to all of them that's the same height. It gives 2 of them access to participate in the sporting experience, but one of them it does not. And even the one in the middle maybe doesn't have a full experience. So that's the concept of equality, where we provide the same supports to everyone. The concept of equity is where we ensure that we provide the support that an individual needs in order to have the same experience. So in the workplace, this is often the concept of affirmative action, where we actually provide additional supports to marginalized or vulnerable groups to ensure that they have access to the same opportunities. And we call that equity. When we're talking about justice, we're actually going a step further to actually remove some of those systemic barriers, some of the causes of inequity, make sure those are addressed, that everybody has the same access regardless of the supports that are provided to them. So we're talking about removal of those systematic barriers when we think about justice. So in an ideal world, obviously, we would love to have everybody have access to everything in the same way without support or accommodation, because we have a just society. But in many cases, we don't have that. So then we're probably looking towards equity and making sure that we're ensuring that everyone gets the supports they need to produce an equitable situation. When we talk about the concept of beneficence, this is really around the benefit to the end user. So when we're talking about end users of the technology, typically we're talking about the person using the technology themselves, but we may also be talking about others who are impacted by its use in their environment. So when we talk about beneficence, that is our duty to ensure that there is a benefit, a direct benefit to the end user of the technology. And then when we talk about non-maleficence, this is the general principle of do no harm. So we're wanting to make sure that in whatever we do, that we are not actually causing additional harm to the individual when we're using a particular type of technology. So there could be multiple forms of harm, and this is where we have to be really careful, making sure that we think about all of the potential sources of harm. And so they could be things like physical harm, psychological or financial harm. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but we also have to consider the potential for direct and indirect harm. So it may not be that the individual is directly harmed by it, but it may be that it produces an environment in which the individual experiences some form of harm. So when we think a bit about how that fits into the world of disability, there are certain questions that we ask and certain things that we want to consider in terms of why it matters. So starting with the concept of autonomy, and remember autonomy is about independent decision making. It matters when we're thinking about people who might have a disability that would lead to a question about their competence or their decision making capacity. So we're really wanting to make sure we're always supporting that independent decision making capacity all along the way. When we're thinking about things like mental health, we see ethical issues around autonomy with forced treatment schemes, where an individual is required to participate in treatment in order to get certain benefits or get other benefits within their environment. We may also be thinking about just general loss of choice. So because of their condition, are they experiencing some kind of loss of choice in the environment in which they operate? And this would be a situation where a decision was made for an individual, not by an individual. We think lots of about autonomy when we think about communication and individuals who have difficulties with communication for any variety of reasons. So the less that somebody's able to communicate, the less that they typically are able to engage in that independent decision making or that they're able to influence the course of what happens to them. And we may also think about autonomy when somebody has reduced functional capabilities. So it could even be that they have a physical disability, which reduces their ability to get in and out of certain environments and therefore reduces their capacity for autonomy. So autonomy is a really big and broad concept when we're thinking about ethics, but it's one of the really important fundamental ones. When we're thinking about justice related to disability, we're thinking about things like eligibility for services. So is the individual having to jump through so many hoops before they get eligibility for services that really they're not actually getting just access to those things that they need? It also comes into play when we're thinking about whether they get access to the technologies they need. So access to those critical assistive technologies that allow them to function independently in their day-to-day lives, how they get access, what the processes are, how difficult it is for them to get access. All of those issues are issues of justice. It also comes into play when we think about more broadly about the services and supports that wrap around technologies or that wrap around an individual's capacity to do their work. So are they able to get access to the necessary health services to support their disability and to the supports that they need to support the use of their technology or whatever other mechanisms that they need to use in their workplace to be successful? When we think about beneficence, and remember beneficence is that principle of ensuring there's benefit to the individual, sometimes we really struggle with the concept of beneficence because it's not always easy to define what the benefit might be to a person in terms of the use of technology. So one of the challenges here is that we as clinicians or as others involved in an individual's access to technology might have a very limited understanding of the actual direct benefit of a particular service or a technology. This is where it becomes really important for us to have conversations with the people we're working with to make sure we understand the benefit to them in their environment. We also think about beneficence when we think about the technologies which might benefit others, but might not actually benefit the user of the technology. So that would be where we might be saying, oh, you need to use this technology because it allows us to get access to all these other things. Maybe it's because we're collecting data about the work that you do. Maybe it's a technology that allows the coworkers that you work with to communicate with you, but not necessarily in reverse. So technologies which benefit others but don't benefit the user, they're questionable in terms of beneficence. We also have a very poor understanding generally about the needs of individuals with specific conditions. So there's lots of technology that's on the market that will work for one person but won't work for someone else. So we have to be really cautious in terms of understanding the needs of those individuals and making sure that they are a part of that decision making. And this is where some of these principles very much have overlap. We're wanting to make sure those conversations increase the autonomy and the capacity for those individuals to get the things that they need. We also think about beneficence very broadly in terms of participation in society and all of the ways that a person might need to participate. So does the technology support their participation in their workplace, in their home life, in society at large, and how do we make sure that they have access to that? When we think about that, the principle of non-maleficence, which is that principle of do no harm, we really want to think about the risk of abuse and the potential for abuse with the technology. Is it possible that that technology could produce harm? And I'm going to go through a few examples of where this might occur. But also, if we didn't provide the technology, and this is the flip side of non-maleficence, would that person experience harm because we didn't provide the technology? So would there be social harms because they don't get to participate? Would there be harms within their workplace because they can't do the job they need to do because they don't have the technology? And there we begin to think about concepts like duty to accommodate, which I will also chat about very briefly in a minute. So now thinking about the technology side of things, so there's an initiative at the World Health Organization called the Global Cooperation on Assistive Technology, or GATE initiative. And the entire principle of this is that they're trying to get technologies into the hands of people who need them in order to participate in society more broadly. So they have defined assistive devices and technologies are those technologies who have a primary purpose, and I think that's really important, that it's the technology's primary purpose to maintain or improve an individual's function and independence, to facilitate participation, and to enhance overall well-being. So as you can imagine, this is a really huge area of study. It's a big area of practice. These technologies can range from consumer technologies to like consumer mainstream to very specific disability-specific technologies. But the key is that the technologies have a primary purpose of improving or maintaining functioning and independence. I'm going to talk about this in a few groupings. So these are just groupings to facilitate the discussion. There certainly is lots of overlap between people's experiences, and I don't want to minimize that intersectionality of people's experiences in terms of having multiple disabilities or multiple challenges, but also to just acknowledge as I start that many of these technologies are things that people who don't identify as having a disability could experience or could use because they're useful tools for many of us, regardless of our ability or disability. So the first I want to talk about is just some of the assistive technologies that are out there for things like cognitive impairment and mental health. And these are some of the things that you might encounter on a day-to-day basis with the people you work with, but they may be things that you use yourself as well to support your day-to-day life. So the first is around supports for cognitive processing. So this is where we might have a challenge with cognitive processing because of a mental health concern or because of something else. It may be things like challenges with memory or executive functioning. And there are lots of technologies on the market now to support these things. Many of them are in the form of software or apps. So you may see things like apps and software to help with processing or sequencing of tasks. For people who have high degrees of anxiety, you may see apps and other softwares or other technologies to support things like mindfulness, which help people to be more successful and independent in their day-to-day lives. And we also see lots of technologies now available on the market for things like symptom management. Again, another really important part of making sure that somebody's independent. In some of my work with older adults, we also see lots of technologies available for things like safety. So to reduce wandering for people who may have later or early to mid-stage dementia, safety concerns like leaving the water on or the heat on, stove alerts, that type of thing. But we're also starting to see an increase in remote monitoring. And we're seeing this both in workplaces, but also in homes, where we're monitoring individuals in terms of their day-to-day activity from a safety perspective. But this begins to bring up some ethical questions around privacy and how we use that data. So just hold on to that thought because we're going to get to the privacy concept, but remote monitoring is really one of those areas where we want to think about it carefully. We also see supports for communication. So for people who may have some difficulty with communications, we see things like speech to text and text to speech. And these are great examples of technologies that started in the world of disability and have really moved into the mainstream world. Many of us now use speech to text or text to speech on our phones or tablets or on our computers. So it's become really quite mainstream, but originally very much started as an assistive technology. And then we see communications with caregivers. So lots of opportunities for caregiver communication in terms of the technology available. On the physical health side, we're seeing things like supports for mobility. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, just some examples of things you might encounter. So mobility aids like wheelchairs, walkers, canes, and crutches. But it also refers to some of those accessible built environment components. So things like ramps or desks that are built so that somebody can actually access them. It includes things like standing desks. So supports for the individual to maintain their physical health and mobility. We also see supports for motor control. So for somebody who might have diminished motor control, we might have things like alternative computer inputs that would include adapted keyboards, adapted mice, and many of us are using these for ergonomic purposes, not because we have a diagnosed or specific disability, but just because it's something that improves or enhances our function. Again, we see things like voice-to-text systems being used here where people don't have the motor control to do the things that they need to do on a daily basis if they're doing computing tasks. But we also see some of the more low-tech components like positioning support, so making sure that people are comfortable in the seated position if that's the position they're working in, or comfortable in any other position so that we can have some preventative aspects of our technology, and ergonomic supports, again, making sure that we're supporting somebody's overall wellness through technology or through the environment that we work with them in. We also see quite a range of assistive technology for sensory loss. So when we think about sensory loss, we often think primarily about hearing and vision. So some of the things that you might encounter in workplaces would be things like hearing aids. Individuals who are wearing hearing aids may not be visible to you. It's often, especially with newer hearing aids, they're very, very small and discreet. So often you may not even know that somebody you're working with is using a hearing aid, but they're actually quite prevalent. It may also be things like FM loops where we're enhancing the auditory input that somebody gets, but not through a direct hearing aid. So we may be asking people to speak into a microphone in order to access that FM loop. But it's also things like we're seeing around closed captioning and real-time sign language interpretation. So more and more we have an expectation that when we're providing services to people that we ensure that we address the sensory loss, the communities who have sensory loss, including those who have hearing loss. So we're seeing an increase in the use of closed captioning, which I think is really great, not just for those with hearing loss, but also for those of us who would prefer to watch videos quietly or prefer to watch other things with the closed captioning, or for whom it just makes more sense. And that sign language interpretation also being very important. And then, of course, there are many supports for people who have vision loss or blindness. So we see lots of computing options for things like visual contrast and size, lots of things you can do on mainstream technologies to really enhance the visual experience for somebody who may have low vision. For those people who have such low vision that they're not able to do that with assisted technology, we're seeing things like screens and document readers. So these may help somebody to be more independent in their environment. And then we also see supports for people who use Braille for their communications. I also want to just mention intelligent assistive technologies as a concept, because I think this is where we start to really question some of the ethics around how we apply our technologies, especially when we think about privacy. So intelligent assistive technologies are those technologies which they're based in complex computing. So they are, and when I say complex computing, I'm thinking very basically things like your phone would be considered a complex computer at this stage, or any of the laptops that most of us are working on, or computers that we're working on. So these technologies are based in that computing world. They are typically internet connected, and we're more and more seeing that not only are they internet connected, but they're using cloud computing in order to access all the data that they need. So if you think about things like speech to text systems, most of that is actually being analyzed in the cloud. So the data is being taken when you're speaking into it, sent up to the cloud for analysis, and then sent back down to whatever device you're using as a text input. So we're seeing a lot of cloud computing and internet connected devices. All of these devices rely on data input and output. So we are typically putting in the data, and we are the input devices, and then they're producing a piece of information for us. So that would be the output coming out of that piece of technology. In some cases, these technologies may use artificial intelligence or machine learning, so they may be learning from you as you go. So for those of you who are familiar with your text functions where you're getting autocomplete or autocorrect, often that's based in an intelligent system where it's actually learning your typical habits, what you normally say. It's predicting the words that you might frequently use. Obviously, sometimes it gets it wrong, but we're seeing more and more that we have artificial intelligence and machine learning concepts built into the technologies that we use. And that goes for our mainstream technologies, but also for our assistive technologies. So now to get back to some of those ethical concepts, and I'm going to go through them one by one. and make sure that we really cover all the things that you might want to consider, I want to first, again, go back to the concept of autonomy. So autonomy, again, being that capacity for somebody to make independent and individual choice. So the first question that we want to ask is whether the technology increases the user's choice. So are we ensuring that whatever technology we're providing allows that individual to make the choices independently that they need to make on a day-to-day basis? A great example of where we see this being really functional is around communication technologies, where we're asking people, or we're giving people the opportunity to actually communicate more effectively through technology than they would be able to otherwise. That typically increases their choice. We're also wanting to make sure that technology allows for independent decision making. So there are supported decision making tools for people who may struggle with that. If it's supporting their independent decision making, then we're really able to support autonomy. But then, of course, we have to think about the flip side. So does the technology remove the user's choice is a really important question to ask. So are we limiting the individual's choice? Are we supporting choices made by others instead of by the individual? Because in that case, then we are limiting autonomy, and ideally, we don't want to be doing that. We also want to know if the technology that we're providing is promoting understanding of all of the available options when somebody has a choice to make. So making sure that the options are presented to individuals in simple and plain language. As you know, the terms and conditions that we all sign off on many of the technologies and softwares that we use are often not in simple and plain language. It does not promote understanding of all the available options or whether you even have an option at all. So we really want to be careful when we're looking at how we present technology, that we ensure that the individual that is using it has full available access to understand all of the options available to them. So as an example of an issue around autonomy, a controlled access elevator is a piece of technology that we often see in many places. So we see them in public buildings, we see them in workplaces, and these are typically in lieu of stairs, where there may be a shorter staircase or a staircase that doesn't have access to an elevator, but there is a requirement for that building to be accessible or for that space to be accessible. So a controlled access elevator is often brought in. They're often made controlled access to ensure that they're only used by the individual who needs it, and that they're not just used by everyone. There's lots of reasons why that might not necessarily be helpful, but it does reduce autonomy. So if you can imagine that you're an individual who can't use the stairs, you're coming in and you'd like to independently get to your destination, but you need to call somebody in order to get a key for them to come and start the elevator for you to be able to use it, then that significantly decreases your capacity for independent choice and decision making in terms of when you come and go and where you go. It also starts to infringe on somebody's privacy, because all of a sudden they don't have the capacity to come and go as somebody else would, and therefore they don't necessarily have the privacy to do the things in their day-to-day life that they would like to do independently. So then moving on to the concept of justice, we're really wondering about who has access to the technology. And we're thinking about all of the systems and policies that are in place which may increase or decrease their access to technology. One of the things we see quite often is that for people who have lower versus higher socioeconomic status, people with lower socioeconomic status typically have less access to the technologies that they need to be independent on their day-to-day lives. This is mostly due to the high cost of technology, but also due to sometimes awareness, education, and technological literacy. So they may not actually have an awareness of the technologies that are available to them, and we may need to advocate for them and ensure that we're providing all of the necessary information and support them to get the information they need to get access to that technology. We also think a lot about who controls access to the technology. So is the access controlled by an individual? Is it controlled by a health professional who needs to do an assessment for the person in order for them to get access to the technology and needs to sign off on it? Is it that there's a caregiver responsible or an insurance program? It might be in a workplace that we're looking at human resources policies around access to the technology or diversity and inclusion policies. And we really want to think carefully about who controls access and how much the individual who needs the technology gets a say in terms of what technology they get and how that technology is used. We also think quite a lot about justice when we think about consumer versus medical technologies. So more and more we're seeing accessibility features built into consumer technologies, which really is moving towards a more equitable opportunity for everybody, where we're seeing that the person who needs the technology can access it because it's already built into their system. So we're increasing justice through accessible consumer technologies. But many cases, the people that we're working with are still using very defined disability-specific medical technologies, which often have that very high cost built in, but also require that the individual self-disclose in order to get access to the technology. So again, going to that question of access to technologies. And as a reminder, we're really working towards justice as an end goal where the cause of the inequality is addressed, but really what we work to on a day-to-day basis is that concept of equity. So making sure that we provide the support somebody needs in order to get access to the same experiences as everyone else. We think about justice a lot in terms of the assessment and application processes. So in workplaces, we're often thinking about what somebody has to do in order to get access to the things they need, how much they need to talk about their disability and their experience in order to access the technologies that they need, and whether a workplace is capable or has the capacity to provide all the things that they require. So a really important concept, thinking about those assessment and application processes, making sure that we really reduce the barriers for individuals to have access. In terms of duty to accommodate, which comes up quite a lot when we think about application processes and how we work within this field, I'm sure most of you are aware that we have a duty to provide accommodations to workers with disabilities. So that duty to accommodate is really broad and ranging. It means that there's a duty to accommodate them in terms of providing the necessary assistive or rehabilitation technologies that they need for the performance of their job. It may also be around modifications to the job itself or the workplace in order to accommodate an individual's needs. In some cases, it may not be required because of circumstances of undue hardship, but it's actually quite difficult to prove undue hardship for an organization. And typically, it's in everyone's best interests to accommodate the needs of the worker regardless. So beneficence and non-maleficence I'm going to discuss somewhat together because they're almost two sides of the same coin in terms of benefit versus harm. So when we think about beneficence, we're wondering, does the technology actually provide an active benefit to the user? So not only does it benefit the user, who else does it benefit? But we really need to question if it only benefits perhaps the supervisor or only benefits the workplace. Not every technology is going to have an abundance of benefit to everybody, but really what we're wanting to make sure here is whether the benefits of the use of technology outweigh the harms that may be experienced by the individual. But here we also need to ask the question of whether the user wants to use the technology. So this overlaps with that autonomy piece where we're saying the person needs to have the capacity to make an individual autonomous choice to use the technology themselves. When we're considering non-maleficence, we're really asking about risks associated with using the technology. And like I said, these are very much two sides of the same coin. So when we're thinking about risks, we ask if there's a physical risk associated with using the technology, if there may be some kind of emotional risk. Sometimes there's trauma associated with certain experiences that may need to be considered. We need to ask whether it's going to impact their cognitive status or their cognitive experience. We also need to wonder or think about whether it's going to potentially impact their social experience on a day-to-day basis. And all of this should be really discussed with the individual who's needing to use the technology in the first place. The reality is that stigma is real, and we need to consider that when we're thinking about how technology gets used in a workspace. We also want to think about institutional risks, so things like whether there are policies in place that would make it more difficult for a person to do their job based on the technology use, that would be considered an institutional risk, or whether that carries financial risk for the individual if they need to contribute to the finances of use of that technology. Again, we also need to consider whether there's risks with the non-use of the technology. So when we think about things like ergonomic setups, things like standing desks, other ergonomic technologies, if we didn't provide that to the worker, would there be a risk? And should we be providing it on a preventative basis in order to prevent risk because of the non-use of the technology? And like beneficence, we're asking, do the risks outweigh the benefits? So we're asking the reverse question, but it really is the same. How do we benefit, or how do we balance the benefit of the technology with the potential risk of it? So one area where we should really think about risk versus benefit is around the use of voice to text software. And this is particularly important when we're thinking about places which are not necessarily, where people don't have access to independent offices or closed spaces. So there may be a significant benefit to the user, and we may be looking at that from a beneficence perspective, where we're saying this person is able to do their job because they have access to voice to text software, and they wouldn't be able to do their job, or maybe they wouldn't be able to do it as efficiently if they didn't have access to that. So there may be a substantial benefit, but there may also be a risk, and the risk in an open office or an open workspace might be that that individual does not have access to privacy when they're doing the work that they're doing. Or it may be that there's a risk to others in the environment because the voice to text is disruptive to others. So it means that we really need to think carefully about the environment that someone works in, how they use the technologies in that environment, and how they interact with others in their space. So beneficence and non-maleficence really work together to make sure that we look at balancing that risk versus benefit discussion. So now just to briefly talk about the issues around privacy and confidentiality. So there is Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It suggests that there should be no arbitrary interference with privacy, family, home, or correspondence, or attacks on honor or reputation to an individual. So the idea is that there is a right to privacy and protection of privacy under the law. This has not been well adopted by many jurisdictions, despite the fact that most jurisdictions have signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has been adopted in the European jurisdictions around the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. But really, privacy and confidentiality is something that I think we all need to pay very close attention to when we're talking about technology and how we use technology on a day-to-day basis. So we really need to think very carefully about things like what data is collected and retained. So when we're collecting data on an individual, whether we're doing it actively or whether we're doing it passively through technology, which is collecting data in the background, we need to think about what data is being collected and whether that data is actually necessary for decision making at any level. So if we're collecting unnecessary data on an individual, then that would not be considered ethical. If we're collecting data that is anonymized and confidential and is required for decision making, then we need to be abundantly clear about what data is being collected. We also need to answer several questions. So we need to think about how data is being transferred and whether it's being transferred securely. We need to think about how data is being stored. And in particular, we need to think about where data is being stored. So many of us that are using cloud computing systems are storing data outside of the country. And I'm making an assumption here that most of you are probably in Canada. So if you are in Canada and you're storing data on a cloud computing service, it's highly likely that unless you have actively chosen a Canadian-based server, that you are storing that data in the United States, and it is therefore not subject to the Patriot Act and privacy laws. So we have to be really careful about where and how data is being stored to ensure it's being stored in a way that protects an individual's privacy and confidentiality. We also want to be really clear about how the data is being used, and ideally we would like to be really transparent about how the data is being used when we're collecting it and with the people that we're collecting it with. And we want to make sure that those terms of use are clear. And again, I talked earlier about the issues around terms and conditions and that they're not often very clear. But if we're collecting data in a workspace and we're collecting data about employees or about coworkers or even about clients that we work with, we really want to make sure that we're very clear about what data we're collecting, why we're collecting it, how it's going to be stored, and how it's going to be used. This data comes up in particular when we're thinking about an individual and their use of technology related to disability and the right to privacy around their disability and their experience. One of the challenges of a workplace having to provide a duty and having the duty to accommodate, and so needing to provide that assistive technology, is that it typically requires the individual to self-disclose the experience of their disability, the nature of their disability, and all the thing, often to go through an assessment process in order to get access to technologies. It's of course understandable that there is a process that needs to be followed in terms of access to technology, that especially that may have financial implications for an organization. But we have to be really cautious here that the data that is being collected for those purposes has a purpose. First of all, that we're not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, and that we're being very clear about how it's used and who has access to it. So privacy becomes really important when we're thinking about issues of self-disclosure of disability and collecting what amounts to effectively medical data on an individual, in order to give them access to services. So this is one of the reasons I really wanted privacy to be a piece of this, because I think it taps into all of those other components of the principles of ethics. So it really speaks to the issue of autonomy. Does the person have a choice as to how their data is being used and what data is being collected? It speaks to justice in terms of their access to technologies and what they have to give up in order to get access to the things that they need in order to be independent. But then it also speaks to the benefit to the user and the potential for harms. So is there a potential for harm in terms of the person giving up access to their data in order to get access to the technologies that they need and providing that data to their company? So I got through that a little faster than I expected, so I'm happy to answer any questions and discuss this further at this point.
Thank you so much, Emma, for this extremely informative webinar. We will move on to the Q&A session, if you don't mind, and to our audience. If you have any questions, please insert them in the question box. Let's start with our first question. Can you give us examples of assistive technologies that help employees navigate the pandemic?
So I guess this is a big, broad question because I think we're all working, many of us are working from home, so we're definitely seeing technologies that are things like mainstream technologies like Zoom, or other sharing technologies, other communication technologies that people are using. So certainly we're seeing that use in the workplace. I'm sure everybody's experienced some of the challenges that have happened, or heard of some of the challenges that have happened just around ensuring the privacy and confidentiality of those systems. So I think that's probably one of the more prevalent ones. But we're also seeing things like access to information. And I think this is something that's come up, it certainly has come up in my recent research around the pandemic and navigating information around the pandemic. Getting access to accessible and relevant information for individuals to be able to make informed choice has become a really critical component of what we think about when we think about ethical access to information, and equitable access to information. Many people with disabilities have not been given relevant information that they need in order to make informed decisions about their safety, but also about how they need to operate within a day-to-day basis to make sure that they're operating within the confines of regulations and rules that they're experiencing, and making sure that they have all the relevant information. So it's really incumbent on all of us to make sure that any information we're providing around the pandemic and around the experience of the pandemic is in an accessible format. And there are lots of technologies to support us in doing that. So I think that's another big piece of the technology component, is making sure that the information is provided is available and accessible.
Thank you so much, Emma, for your answer. Our next question is, how can employers support their employee in assessing the risk and benefits of assistive technologies that could support their work?
It's a really tough question. There isn't sort of a clear answer to it. I would say typically this is where I think it's really important to have open discussion with employees. So to say, here are the technologies available, or here are the technologies that can be supported. Do you perceive any risk? And what are the risks that you perceive? So I'll just go back to that slide quickly, just around some of those risks that we might consider. Sorry, I went back way too far. So these physical, emotional, cognitive, social, institutional, and financial risks, starting in a place like this where you're saying, is there a potential that this technology is going to harm you in some way from a physical perspective, or that there's potential for emotional harm? Is it going to challenge how you do your work from a cognitive perspective? Is it going to make it more difficult for you? Do you perceive a social risk? Is it going to change your experience with your peers? Are there any risks to the technology in terms of your experience from how you interact with your employer, how you interact with any institutional regulations? Or is there potential that you are going to have a financial risk attached to it? So really you can use those kinds of broad headings to have a discussion, but really what I think is most important is saying, what will this technology do for you? What are the benefits of it? And then having that discussion around what the potential risks are, and ultimately supporting that employee to make that individual choice from an autonomous perspective. So going back to that concept of individual choice and decision making, saying, yes, this is a technology I want to use. Yes, this is something that I think outweighs the benefits for me. And at the end of the day, I think it has to be an incredibly individual decision.
Makes sense. Thank you, Emma. Our next question is there anything employers can do to improve the process of self-disclosure when employees need technology for their workplace?
Yeah, self-disclosure, I think, can be very difficult. I think it's obviously, I think it's easier in some senses when somebody has a very visible physical disability because they almost don't have a choice. But that doesn't mean that they are willing to give all of the information about their condition. So I think as employers, what's important is that we provide a safe place that's confidential for self-disclosure, so people know that they have options in terms of who they can speak to. And I think the option is really important. People may feel safe with one person and not with another. So having an option in terms of their opportunity for self-disclosure, ensuring that they know about confidentiality of that self-disclosure process, so that they've been given all of the relevant information about how, like I said, what data is being collected, how that data is being used, who it's being shared with, making sure that they feel confident that their data is being protected and that any information they provide is being protected by their employer. And then really importantly, making sure we're only asking people to self-disclose those things which are critical for their experience of their work. So that they're not needing to self-disclose things which aren't relevant to their day-to-day work or aren't relevant to the requests that they're making. So not just using blanket self-disclosure forms that may ask a lot of questions that aren't relevant, but really asking the person to identify those components of their experience which are relevant to the technology use or relevant to their work experience and their need for accommodation. There's also the option to have it be an outside party, so to go to a third party for assessment and self-disclosure, so that really the data is not being collected by the employer, but the third party is able to make a recommendation, a trusted third party to the employer, which really allows the person self-disclosing to have a much better sense that they are that they're being protected in terms of somebody else having all of that data about them and conducting that assessment in maybe a safer way than they would experience within their workplace.
Thank you, Emma. And can you help us identify what type of third party would be able to assist in those disclosure discussions?
Sure. So depending on the disability, it may be that there is or it may be that there's psychological services or things like occupational therapists who might be able to work on a contractual basis to handle self-disclosure around disability and recommendations for accommodations. So it would be looking towards a professional field for people who have a duty and a code of ethics that they're working within that would require that level of confidentiality, but also have the professional experience in order to provide the recommendations that would be needed to the employer.
Makes sense. Thank you. Another question is, beside privacy issues, what are some known examples of ethical issues resulting from the use of a certain technology in the workplace?
It's a very broad question. So other than privacy, I mean, obviously, like as I said, privacy is a big issue. Certainly, I think the non-provision of technology is a major ethical issue. So if we are not providing the things that people need, then we are doing them a disservice, but we are also not meeting an ethical standard in terms of that duty to ensure that everybody has access to the things they need to do their day-to-day work. That can result in harm in any number of ways. It can result in harm in terms of the person not being able to conduct their job functions and therefore loss of employment. But it could also result in harm from a psychological standpoint, where we're asking the person to do something that they're really not capable of without access to that technology, and our non-provision of it really could result in trauma on that person from that person's experience and psychological harm. So I think other than privacy, the really big risk from my perspective is non-provision, that we don't adequately support the people that we work with to do the things that they need to do on a day-to-day basis, and the harms that can result from that.
Thank you, Emma. And on the same topic, I know you mentioned it in your presentation. Can you talk to us about the duty for employers to accommodate in regards to assistive technologies? What are technologies that are commonly required?
Yeah, so typically the duty to accommodate is only specific to those technologies which support an individual to do their job. So if somebody requires, say, a powered wheelchair for day-to-day mobility, typically it's not the employer's duty to accommodate that request or that need, but it would be the duty to accommodate the ways that they, for example, access the computer. So if somebody has a severe physical disability and needs to access the computer through a switch access system or through voice to text, then the employer would have that duty to accommodate for the individual to be able to access their job. We also see, so computer access is a big area where we see duty to accommodate. We also see duty to accommodate often when it comes to technology around things like desk spaces, the ergonomics of how people are seated, the different technologies that they use to prevent repetitive strain injuries. So we see a lot of technology being used to from a preventative perspective, but also in treating some of those things that may have occurred to somebody because of their position in their workspace. So I would say that probably is the second one. Outside of computer access, we'd primarily see things around ergonomics. And then I think the other big one we would see would be around accessible environments. So things like door openers, automated door openers, elevators to accommodate staircases, ramps, that type of things, widening of doorways, accessible bathrooms. So making sure that everybody has access to the things they need within their environment from an accessibility perspective to make sure that they're able to access and use the environment.
Thank you. And following up on this answer, are you aware of any cost associated to those technologies?
Well, I think all of the technologies have a substantial cost, or not necessarily, it depends on the technology. Some are lower cost than others, obviously. Cost benefit is a really difficult thing to assess in terms of productivity, but and I think this is one of the reasons that it has been coded into law as a duty to accommodate, is because if we all just worked on a cost benefit analysis basis, then we would just never hire anybody with a disability, and then that would be a whole other ethical issue. So the cost benefit is typically around productivity, and we're typically seeing that with the technology, the individual is able to conduct the duties of their job and able to be productive in their work, and without the accommodation, they're not able to. So there have been some analyses done on cost benefit of certain types of technologies, and if there were interests in from people around trying to find some of that research, I'd be more than happy to support finding that. To see if that's available if it comes to certain types of technologies, but it's not typically researched on a generic basis. It's usually very technology specific.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do we make sure that technology is compliant with all the ethical principles? And is there some sort of checklist or support services that ensure compliance?
This is a question I get asked quite often when I have this conversation about ethics and technology. There isn't a checklist. Um, Ethics, I think one of the biggest challenges with ethics is that it's an incredibly gray area. There's a lot about ethics that is about the user's experience and the experience that they have with the individuals they work with, or with the environment that they interact with. So but I always go back to the importance of a frank, open, and honest conversation with the individual that covers all of those grounds. So making sure that we're really talking to the person who needs the technology about what is the best for them, that we're making sure that we provide all available information, that we disclose anything that we're going to be collecting or keeping with them, um, that we make sure that they are making individual choices around their technology use, and that we're allowing that autonomous decision making based on a discussion around the potential risks and benefits of the technology from their experience.
Makes total sense. Our next question is there technology in the workplace that has brought significant positive impact, if you're aware of it?
I think there are lots. I mean, some of the technologies that I think we all use on a day-to-day basis have brought significant positive impact for many people. Certainly, the fact that we now have built-in accessibility features, it has changed life for many, not just those who previously would have identified as a person with a disability. Many of us probably use features without even knowing that we're using them. So I think some of the big things that have changed are around mobile access technology, so things like tablets and computers that really allow us to get access to all those accessibility features. Things like iPads and iPhones, when they came out with their new accessibility features, they've made a huge impact because they really started to integrate some of the features that were only disability specific in the past into the mainstream. That's made a difference both in workplaces, but also just in day-to-day life. And it's done so in a way that's been more affordable than it has been in the past. So voice to text is now ubiquitous. We see it across technologies. And those types of things have really made a difference for many, many people.
Thank you, Emma. And I'm sure you already answered this, but if we can provide a summary, what are some key recommendations for implementing assistive technology for new employers wanting to establish an inclusive workplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's about setting early policy around a willingness to accommodate that's not necessarily framed in the concept of duty, but that employers should, or ideally are going to want to support their employees to have the best possible employment experience, and that includes access to the technologies that they need. So um, it includes things like ensuring that there's a budget in place for access to these technologies as they're needed, that there's a process in place for people to safely self-disclose, that that there's a process in place for safe assessment and for thorough evaluation of what the individual needs. And that those pieces are well communicated to the employees very early in the process, so they never have to go looking for that information, that it's really information which is given to them at the outset when they become an employee, when they become part of the company.
Thank you. And following up on that, are there any sources that employers can access to learn about the different assistive technologies that are available?
There isn't, it would be great if there were. There's not sort of a generic clearinghouse of assistive technologies, unfortunately. There are a few online assistive technology databases, but they tend to be fairly obtuse and difficult to follow. But what there are is really great suppliers and distributors. And so I would encourage people, if they are depending on the community that they're in, to find out who in their community or who near to them is a supplier of assistive technologies, and who are the primary distributors, and to get to know them and build those relationships. In my experience, having those relationships with those individuals means that you can call, and often when I'm teaching clinicians about assistive technology and what they need to do, I think it's the same advice. Building those relationships means that you can call and say, I have a I have somebody I'm working with who has the following needs, and you don't necessarily need to know all the technologies, but to be able to identify what the individual's needs are is a really important piece. So technologies, they change so rapidly that what's available today in terms of assistive technology may not be what's available in 6 months. And so really identifying the need and then going to those distributors and saying, here are the needs that we need to address. What are the technologies currently available that would be able to fulfill that need or address that need, and using those relationships. So really the importance to me is around relationship building and access to the resources that you already have in your community that you may just not currently have a relationship with.
Thank you very much, Emma. Our next question is, what are some tips and tools that can be used to protect data privacy?
Yeah, data privacy is a big one. So one is just really to be very aware of um, how your data is being kept and stored, being very familiar with data protection regulation. Canada has really good data protection regulation, but it's only applicable to data that's collected and stored in Canada. So making sure you're really familiar with those data protection regulations, with all the requirements of them, and making sure that you're following them. So that relates both to the clients that you may have as a company, but also to your employees, making sure that you're following all those regulations on both counts. And then when you're looking for new technologies, and I think this applies to all technologies that you're looking for within a workplace, whether it's assistive technology or other technologies, that you are really asking a lot of questions of the people who are selling or distributing that technology to you around how the data is used, how it's stored, where it's stored, that kind of thing. So really asking those questions, being critical about the responses you're getting, and making sure that you're really getting proper answers to your questions, not just marketing answers.
Thank you very much, Emma. And in terms of rehabilitation, how does the technological assistance improve rehabilitation?
Sure. So there's lots that we can do without technology for rehabilitation, certainly, but there's lots of ways that we're now seeing where technology can enhance the rehabilitation experience because it can provide extra data for the rehabilitation process. It can provide monitoring, or it may be that the technology actually supports physical rehabilitation. So we have lots and lots of ways that we're seeing technology supported rehabilitation. We're also seeing, particularly in the areas of mental health, we're seeing that we get better access to things like supports and clinicians through technology. So there are now apps available where somebody can access their therapist through an app, or they might be able to access coping skills through an app where we didn't have those kinds of technologies before. So really this idea of supporting rehabilitation, not that the technology is the rehabilitation tool, but that it's used by professionals to support the work that they already do. So lots of different ways that we're seeing technology supporting rehabilitation and making it more effective over time.
Thank you. And on the same topic as well, how does technology help with the management of disability and chronic illnesses? And what are those technologies, if you can give examples?
Yeah, so when we think about more longer term management of disability and chronic illness, we're often thinking about things like prevention of secondary complications, management of symptoms, management of medications in some cases. So this is another field where we're seeing rapid change. There's lots of apps, lots of software right now that's helping to manage some of that. One great example of a non-software based option is for people who have severe physical disabilities who may be using a powered wheelchair. We're now seeing technological systems which can monitor a person's position in space, make sure that they're getting adequate position changes so that we're preventing any of those secondary complications associated with difficulty breathing or joint contractures, pressure ulcers, that kind of thing that might happen. So we're seeing better management and prevention of those secondary pieces. Certainly for other people with other chronic conditions, we're seeing things like like diabetes management apps, which are helping people to manage their nutrition, their medication, their symptomology, um, and also helping to connect them with professionals on a more regular basis so that they have access to ongoing support from the people that they need support from.
Thank you, Emma. And then technology is adopted at a very fast pace and sometimes quite naturally. So what are the aspects that are often overlooked?
I think one of the big aspects that's often overlooked is we tend to like new and shiny things, and we don't necessarily think about the longevity of the support for that technology. So really, although it's often very exciting when we're looking at new options for technology and new things that may solve a problem that we have, it's really important that we consider whether that's going to be supported in the coming years, whether we're going to be able to get the support that we need from the manufacturer, whether that technology is actually going to exist in a few years from now. So not that we shouldn't use new technologies, but I think we often overlook the importance of support from the people who build and manage those technologies on an ongoing basis. I'm sure many of you have experienced having a technology that somebody has decided to stop producing and you can't get parts for, or that is no longer supported, like a software that's no longer supported, and all of a sudden you're stuck because you've become quite accustomed to it. So really thinking about the wraparound services around a technology, it's not just the technology, it's also how we are going to use that with some sense of longevity.
Perfect. And we're arriving at our last three questions. Thank you so much for doing such a great job in answering those broad questions. So in terms of technologically assisted rehabilitation, is there a particular aspect you would like to bring attention to or to spread awareness about?
I think these are the things that I call soapboxes in a sense, where I get passionate about certain things because I think they're really important to talk about. And um, in this case, I think it's the idea that more and more technologies are coming into the mainstream, and that's a really good thing. That the more that we normalize the use of these technologies by everybody, and um, that we recognize that all of us really use assistive technology on a day-to-day basis, whether it's that we're using a calendar to support our memory in terms of the things that we need to do today, or a task list that's organized, different softwares that we use. Many of us use technology on a day-to-day basis, and we don't necessarily think of it as assistive technology, but it is. And so really, for me, the idea that we all use assistive technology helps to reduce some of that stigma and reduce some of those potential risks to somebody, some of those more emotional, psychological risks, because we acknowledge that everybody requires support. And that support may differ from person to person, but acknowledging that we all require support in various ways, I think, is a really important piece of looking at how we use technology.
Perfect. And so we have a couple comments that I would read to you. The first one is, great job of answering these general and broad questions. Disability management requires a case-by-case individualized approach to each case and every situation, even when there isn't the complication of a pandemic. So good points are being raised.
Yes, that is
And
very true.
and the other comment is, investing in obsolete support is never fun. Um, and lastly, so this is a suggestion, askjan.org. Do you have a comprehensive awareness of assistive technology? So to our audience, if you'd like to check the website for further information on that subject. And then our last question for you, Emma, is, if you had one message to convey to our audience, what would it be?
I think we sometimes get afraid of assistive technology, and we see it as a hurdle that needs to be overcome. So I think my biggest message would be that it's just a tool. We use tools every day, and we just need to identify the best tool for the individual at the time. In in concert with that person. So allowing them to help us identify the tools that they need and ensuring that they really are at the center of that process. So to not be afraid of it and to make sure that we work very closely with the people that we work with to make sure that we meet their needs for the benefit of everybody.
Thank you so much, Emma, for this compelling webinar and for your thorough review of ethical principles that need to be considered in rehabilitation and wellness, as well as their application to different types of technology available in this field. Thank you so much. And to our audience,